going to do a deep dive on the last 6.5 decades of Nigeria. We're going to go decade by decade to unpack the themes that shaped every decade and how those narratives overlapped from one decade to another, and how they shaped Nigeria's journey through nationhood, and how perhaps it explains why we are currently where we are as a nation or a country and as a people. Well, to help me do the analysis and provide some context to each of those decades from the 60s to the 2020s, I'm joined by Armsfree Ajanaku, the Executive Director, Grassroots Center for Rights and Civic Orientation. Happy Independence Day to you, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Abdullahi. Happy Independence Day. My privilege to be here.
Right, okay, so let's start from where it all began in 1960. I mean, this was, of course, the year of Africa, where a lot of African countries were getting their independence. Like we did say earlier, 17 African countries got their independence on this particular year. Nigeria's own came at 1960. Well, the theme is independence, fragility, and war. These are the three key words that shaped 1960, because we became independent in October of 1960. 63, we became a republic, and from that, the chaos began. What are your 2 cents about this particular decade and what it says about how we began this journey?
Yeah, this particular decade, if you ask me, started as a decade of optimism. The lowering of the Union Jack, the fact that we had a prime minister at the time who talked about Nigeria's manifest destiny. And the manifest destiny was essentially speaking to the potential, the massive potential of the country as a beacon of hope for the black race. Don't forget that we are also coming from a background of, the push towards decolonization, nationalism, that optimism that comes with the fact that self-governance will bring about critical solutions to our national problems. Nigeria was talking about developing. In fact, Nigeria was standing up to Africa. Remember the first test, by France in the Sahara, where they tested, an explosive device, and Nigeria was, one of the countries to stand up. Remember also Nigeria's role in terms of rejecting the Anglo-Nigerian Defense Pact, the fact that we are independent and we should not be subjugated in terms of defense decisions. And so you could see that this decade started with optimism, but of course, that optimism also met with a lot of internal contradictions. The tripod on which Nigeria stood made it more like an ethnic kind of tripod, whereby every ethnicity was competing for dominance. And of course, we saw that unraveling with the first coup, and of course the counter coups, and all of the other issues that took us to the civil war.
Yeah, obviously, some of the highlights, the high points of the 60s were those the first coup, the counter coup, and then the eventual civil war. But let's take a look at this one. Very important also to note that in 1960 we began with an estimated population of a little over 40 million. By the end of the decade, we're crossing over 52 million plus. That's after the millions of people that were killed during the Nigerian Civil War. We ended in 1969 with 52.3 million. So what ushered in the next decade? Let's take a look at the 70s and what there is to talk about. One of the highlights of the 70s was economical, the oil boom, and the eventual centralization of the government, because we're just coming out of a civil war. Your 2 cents on how well or how mismanaged that opportunity was, because it appeared like a silver lining to Nigeria after decades of war, the devastation, the destruction, the crisis that engulfed the nation. The next decade started on a good footing, didn't it?
Yes, it should have started on a good footing, only that the internal contradictions we carried over from that decade of 1960, to the Civil War were not properly resolved. So the no victor, no vanquished mantra that ended the war seemed not to have sunk in properly in terms of the 3 R's, you know, the reconstruction, the reconciliation, and all of that. There were challenges in that context. And so there were still several parts of the country where there was disaffection. But of course, the war itself really sapped our national resources. You know, a lot of lives were lost. We did not, you know, engage in serious production in terms of other aspects of our economy. And then we happened to chance on oil. You know, oil came and became the main focus. And that, again, is something people point to, that from that decade up to where we are now, the fixation on oil, the lack of capacity to diversify the economy away from oil has remained one of...
You think it started with this particular...
Yes, because one of the popular mantra you had in this decade was, you know, our problem was not money, but how to spend it. And where you now had a system where the state was principally focused on rent collection, because we were not even at the time adding value to the oil. Yes, we had refineries spring up and all of that. You know, our first refinery came in this particular decade. But of course, we know what happened to the refineries because of course, the lack of sustainability, and then the fact that it was a state-centric kind of business, whereby we were not really ensuring that the private sector played this role. Till today,
right,
we are still struggling with deregulation. We are still struggling with ensuring that commanding height of the economy, even in the oil sector, has you know, private players, you know, dominate it. And this is a decade that would say still lives, the impacts of this decade still live with us till today.
Right, and of course talks about missed opportunities. Remember, the 70s ended on a positive note for Nigeria because it ended with a return to civilian rule. However, the common trend is that number again, the population boom. In over 20 years, we added close to 30 million people to the Nigerian population. By 1979, we had 69, I beg your pardon, 0.7 million Nigerians as far as the data goes. So let's cross over to the 80s now, where I believe things began to take another dramatic turn. 80s dominated by coups, different coups, and obviously the ouster of the Shehu Shagari administration. But let's talk about what the 80s represent, because Nigeria at the global stage was beginning to develop a notoriety, because towards the mid-80s and the late 80s, the drug trafficking situation happened. But what are some of those developments that shaped this one alongside economic and, you know, political leadership?
Thank you so much, Abdullahi. I think in these decades, there's a way these decades interweave into one another, because the return to democracy after long years of military interregnum happened in 1979. And of course, we had a constituent assembly, and, you know, which paved the way for what you may describe as the right way that constitution should be made, where you had a constituent assembly, putting forward the draft of the 1979 constitution, and all of that kind of horse trading in the Nigerian people sitting down together to determine what document should serve as the governing instrument of the country. Yeah. But now, democracy ran again into troubled waters. Yeah. And the question, a very fundamental question, is why did democracy run into troubled waters? It ran into troubled waters because of the same attitude of the political class that had refused to learn from the fact that the previous issues they had gave a blank check to the military to come in. Yeah. And we also learned another important lesson in that decade, which is the abysmal nature of military rule. The fact that military rule stifles civil society, stifles civic voice, stifles even the creativity, because we must not forget that Nigeria as a people, we are a very vibrant people. We are not people who should be governed by the barrel of the gun. And so the generals we had in that 70s decade coming into the decades of the 80s were generals that did not do our democratic development very much good, especially when you look at the 1980s.
Right.
The Buhari coup, for instance, the Babangida coup, and which now lasted, and we had an interminable transition program. Democracy was kept in abeyance for long in this decade.
Yeah, and of course, some of the common denominators from the 60s to the 70s and the 80s was the issue around corruption, which has been used by almost every military junta that took over, right? And in the 80s, in the early 80s, when the Buhari regime took over, he used the famous word squandermania, right? Embezzlement and all of that to describe why the military needed to come in. And then, unfortunately, some 18 or thereabout months later, the Babangida administration came in. But how do you see this overlap of the same issues being used as an explanation for a military takeover?
Honestly, this decade is also a reminder to Nigerians, and not just West Africa, that military rule is an anathema. It is not something that, as a people and even as Africans, we can defend one man in some uniform pointing a gun to order the affairs of the country. That is a settled matter. And so even in the Sahel countries where you have the democratic backsliding, they are also feeling the pinch. That aspect of the civic freedom of citizens. So in this decade, that question you asked about the use of corruption as the ready excuse for the military to take over, the question we then ask is, did the military deal decisively with corruption? Even with all of their retroactive laws, all of the lack of respect for the rule of law, the tribunals they set up, were they able to finally deal a decisive blow to corruption? Or did they even multiply corruption? I mean, the jury is out, but if you look at the literature and every detail around this, it is clear that even under the military, corruption began to fester.
Right.
Because power corrupts, as is said, and absolute power will corrupt absolutely. So the military wielded absolute power, and of course, corruption multiplied on their watch.
And on the economic front, right, things began to unravel. The price of oil crashed. We had to implement, or the Babangida administration at the end of the day had to implement the structural adjustment program. And for the most part, this is when we began to see the eventual fall of the naira and austerity measures, right? Cost of living began to go up, and some would argue that we didn't see the rebounding of the naira to its former glory. But let's talk about this and how it shaped what came next in the 90s. I mean, these were the mid-80s were the Babangida years, and the early 90s were also the Babangida years. So let's take a look at the 1990s. It represented some sort of political hope, because there was a lot of pushback from several groups, right? Some of them in exile for a return to civilian rule. So obviously there was a lot of repression, there was a lot of call for transition from military to political leadership. Talk to us about what the early 90s represented as far as the outlook of Nigeria as a country is concerned.
Yeah, so by the early 90s, the record is clear that the military had dribbled themselves into a corner, and both in terms of their legitimacy, because they even did not have legitimacy in the first place, but in terms of even that basic acceptability of the military as a governing apparatus for the country was totally no longer acceptable to Nigerians. And of course, you could see Nigerians in their vibrancy demanding a return to civilian rule and a return to the path of democracy. And of course, you had those very first elections, that the military regime of IBB cancelled before the June 12th election itself. All of these show that Nigeria really is a country by virtue of its diversity and by virtue of the vibrancy of its people that had come to terms with the fact that the vehicle of democracy is the preferred vehicle for us to arrive at the point of our national aspirations. And without that vehicle, any other vehicle was no longer acceptable. But if you ask me, at the end of that decade, what was the impact? In 1999, we saw the return to civilian rule, and of course, President Obasanjo came in, tried to stabilize the system to some extent, and from that point to where we are, it may not be a pass mark, but it has not been an abysmal failure. We can do better than we have done since 1999. But of course, this is the reality of our country today.
Right. But by the end of the 90s, ushering in the new millennium, look at that figure there, 118.2 million Nigerians. Our population more than doubled after just 40 years. And it meant more mouths to feed, more responsibility. GDP per capita was gradually coming down. And of course, by the end of the 90s, we ushered in the current republic, the Fourth Republic. So let's take a look at the 2000s, shall we? By the beginning of the new millennium, Nigerians already were in a civilian rule or democratic rule under former President Olusegun Obasanjo. And this particular period represented some sort of hope, right? But also a reality that we were not the giant that we once were, because there are so many gaps, financially speaking, because then we had to make the push for debt forgiveness because we're heavily indebted. Nigeria has been disconnected from the international economic markets because of the Abacha regime and some of the sanctions that we had to deal with. Talk to us about some of the issues that shaped the 2000s, especially from 2000 to 2010.
Yes, so talking about those issues, of course, democracy came, and by the 2000s, we saw the many challenges that democracy had to confront. One of the hallmarks of the Obasanjo administration was that whole tug of war between governance and the rule of law. We saw what was happening in the states. We also saw the reality of our election, the fact that the people wanted a free, fair, credible, and transparent electoral process, which became a mirage in a sense because barefaced rigging of election became the order of the day. We had, for example, the 2003 and 2007 elections, which go down in the halls of infamy for their barefaced, the kind of dishonesty and the kind of electoral malfeasance that characterized those elections. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we grappled with that same reality coming from these previous decades, over-reliance on oil. So when you talk about the population, the exponential growth of the population, but you can also see that our economy was not expanding at a level that would, that would absorb the people, that were being produced. So when you talk about the mouths that we had to feed, yes, we had mouths to feed, but were we expanding our bases to feed them?
But what about those privatizations that happened in the mid-2000s? Because that's what the Obasanjo administration pretty much, was beating his chest about how they privatized or liberalized the Nigerian economy and allowed for foreign investment to actually come in. We saw what happened with the telecoms industry, for instance. I mean, the power sector, not so much to date. But what about those privatization records of the 2000s?
Yes, so some of the privatization efforts worked well, like the telecoms. I mean, it was liberalized for the first time. Many Nigerians could hold a phone in the same country where a minister once said that, phones, mobile phones, were not supposed to be for everybody. But that decade took care of that. But the question is the bigger picture. Let's not focus on the tokens that governance brought. Yes, there are some elementary things, because by the time we're talking about even the GSM in Nigeria, several of our neighbors in West Africa were already, they had already even forgotten that they were using mobile phones and all of that. And so Nigeria was practically behind when it comes to the kind of the telecom sector we're talking about. But there were other aspects of the privatization that amounted to a scandal. We saw in this country how many state-owned enterprises were sold at giveaway prices to friends and cronies of the people in power. And we saw huge, massive investment that the Nigerian people made. Yes, if we argue that, well, according to the Washington Consensus, it's not the business of the state to be in business. The business of the state is to regulate and then create the enabling environment. But should you give your patrimony away on a platter of gold? And you mentioned the power sector, where privatization happened, but it did not translate till today. It has not translated, to Nigerians having stable power in their homes. And so we have to be able to ruthlessly interrogate what some people would put forward as massive successes and say, no, these were just modest gains that did not really amount to a transformation of our country. And we also saw the proliferation of security concerns. First, the Niger Delta situation that the Edward administration negotiated with its amnesty program. But by the end of the decade, we had the beginning of the Boko Haram insurgency, which has shaped the subsequent decade and a half that we're about to segue into. So let's take a look at the 2010s and some of the issues that we need to focus on. So obviously, insecurity, the biggest talking point to date, the economy and some of the struggles that we had to deal with, and a demographic rise. We talk about the younger generation, much of the people that Nigeria is trying to cater for. In fact, that concerns are about what kind of future they are going to hold were born, at least began to witness a lot of shifts in this particular period. So let's talk about them. Clearly, the 2015 election stands out because for the first time in Nigeria's history, an incumbent lost to an opposition figure like the late President Muhammadu Buhari. But much of the 2010s were dominated by insecurity and an economic downturn. We had the recessions under the Buhari administration, and then we eventually had COVID by year 2020. Talk to us about how these issues continue to shape the Nigeria that we live in today. Absolutely. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a nexus between each of these decades, and the security question is a very critical question. And when you look at one of the security challenges you mentioned, which became sort of Nigeria's Achilles heel connected to the economy, the Niger Delta militancy, where oil installation, the lifeblood of our country's economy, due to our hopeless dependence on the oil sector, became affected. And the Yar'Adua administration took a very bold and courageous step in ensuring that not only that he was focusing on the kinetic approach, he was able to focus on a more dialogue-driven approach in calling the militants, calling the agitators in the Niger Delta, calling them to the table, giving them an amnesty program. Until today, there's still ongoing trainings, there's still ongoing support to the youth of the Niger Delta who had become restive at the time. Right. That's to show that there is a roadmap to solving our security challenges. Right. And it is about getting governance right. If we get governance right in the areas of education, basic infrastructure, especially in the rural area, healthcare, and all of the other deliverables, which are, by the way, all enshrined in Chapter 2 of our Constitution under the fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy, then we will be able to prevent rather than fighting the fires of insecurity.
Right. And of course, during the 2010s, we've had several debates about the census that we've missed out multiple occasions, and to date, the approximations are like 230, 240. I mean, the numbers are haywire about what Nigeria's current population is, but I think the consensus is that we have more than enough mouths to feed, and the economy is, well, still struggling. I mean, the data supposedly shows some slight recovery. But if you look at this particular decade and what we have right now, which is of course halfway into the next decade that was supposed to be analyzed, you realize that the common denominators are still the same: insecurity, economy, and of course this demographic rise about what to do with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who are looking up to the next couple of years that will shape Nigeria's trajectory. Well, fantastic analysis. Armsfree Ajanaku, thank you so much for the insight and of course your
Thank you, Abdullahi.
Thank you very much.
And happy independence again.
Right, thank you very much for that.